All right. My name is Darren Hoffmann. I work at the University of Iowa. I've been working with cyberanatomy for a while, and I guess I'm just going to do a brief tutorial on some of my thoughts on design of sessions for use either in class or at home. Whether you're planning on putting cyberanatomy content in front of students in your classroom or whether you're going to have them watch things at home or independently in the lab, the key to making it really worth their while and worth your effort is making sure that your session is really kind of well thought out and clean before the students see it. I'm just going to walk you through some of my process if I was going to make a session. So the first thing I would recommend is being really clear on what you want your target to be. If you're working on a unit on the upper limb and you want to talk about muscles of the upper limb, it would probably not be a great idea to try and build a session where you demonstrate all of the muscles of the upper limb in one session. The more targeted you can be, the better. It might be a good idea to do maybe just the shoulder muscles, or even just doing something like rotators of the shoulder, and kind of making your sessions as bite-sized as possible is a really effective way to kind of drop them into your lectures in class. And I think students respond to seeing some moments of it and then going back to a more traditional presentation where things are maybe bulleted on slides. So they keep the organization from the slides, but then they use the immersive moments as a way to kind of solidify them. I'm just going to build a session, say, about like the pancreas, for example. We'll just use that as an example of a way to build a session. So you'd start by building a session. You can start with regions or systems. I'm going to go with regions and just go with abdomen. In reality, I might want to include the pelvis because there may be some structures in the pelvis group that would help add to the context of the view. But just for the sake of this, we'll just go with abdomen. And then my systems, I'm going to keep skeletal in there because I want to keep the bones there so that students can see the context and it's not just floating objects that don't have any context. I don't think I need muscles for anything, don't need nerves for anything, but I do want to do the digestive organs so that I get the pancreas and the organs around it. And I want the circulatory organs as well so I can get the blood vessels that are around the pancreas. I think that'll work. So if I open all those up, it'll take a minute to load those structures. Maximize my window so I have more working space. And so it'll just stack up the structures here in a minute. So we're starting out with everything present. And your first step when you're building a session should always be to kind of look at everything that's there and make sure you have everything you need before you get started. Because if you start building a session and then decide, you know what, I am going to need something from that pelvis, you can't add it in without it erasing all the work that you've done. So you need to just kind of make sure everything you need is present. And I don't really need anything else pelvic related here. I think it's fine. I have a lot more than I need, but that's not a big problem. We can work with that. Let's start by getting rid of the things we don't need. A lot of these superficial arteries and veins I don't have any interest in including in this presentation. So I'm going to start by wiping them out of the scene. And the way to do that is just to click on each object and just delete it. You can click on multiple objects as well. If you click on one and then hold the control key down and you can keep clicking on others, it will add them to a pile, and you'll see the words multiple objects down here that'll tell you that you've got more than one thing selected. There's also sort of a color change on the object when you select it. Some of these finer vessels are hard to click on, so you have to kind of be slow and steady with your mouse, but if you get a few things, you can click them and they'll go away. And if you're not sure, if I click this and I click this and I feel like, oh, maybe I clicked on the intestines, I'm not sure, just click off. Click off on the side and it'll undo it. But I don't want any of these. These are not really related to what I want the students to think about with pancreatic anatomy. So I'm just going to get rid of those. And then I think I'm all right at this point. There's still probably a little more than I actually need, but I don't necessarily need to delete them at this point. Um, the next thing I'll suggest as sort of a way of going through a session is to build it from less objects and then add more. I think it works really well with the way students think about anatomy. If you can start with one object and add objects around it, it helps with the 3D relationship concepts. So in order to kind of isolate ourselves down, I'm going to use these groups that you see down towards the bottom. If I just click on the arteries group, all of the arteries have now been selected in the simulation. So all I have to do is grab one of them. If I mouse over it, I can tell I'm on it because the label will pop up. If I just grab that and drag it, all the arteries are going to come with me. And I want to get them out of here because all I want students to see in this first view is the pancreas and the bones. So I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to move it away so it's definitely out of view. I am going to want these structures because I want to bring the aorta in after a couple of images, but I don't want it there at first, so I'm just going to move it out of the way. Likewise, the veins, I can do the same thing, so I'm going to try and here's the veins, grab all those and move them out of the field. And maybe I'll move them over here so that I don't get them confused with the arteries when I'm trying to grab specific arteries. Okay, now all that's left is the digestive organs and the skeleton. So this is perfect. So this might be a good place to start for this particular presentation. I'm going to add a slide here so that I can title it, and I'm going to call it Pancreas 101. And I like the view that I've got here, so to store the view, I'm going to hit Store Current View. You have to remember to do this every time you are ready to move on to the next slide, because it's going to default to whatever setup was when you started. So if I clicked on this keyframe, that's going to take me back to when everything was back together, and that's not anything that I really want. You know, this is where I want to start my session, so I have to make sure that I store that view before I move on to build my next slide. In fact, I might as well just go ahead and delete this view because I'm not going to use this for anything. So here I am at my first slide. I like the way it looks, but so maybe a student might have a hard time seeing the pancreas in there. So I think what I'll do is just add a label. So just clicking on this call out or note thing, and then find it where it's on pancreas, and then boom, there it goes. And I can kind of move this wherever I need it to go. You can make it larger or smaller, depending on I guess the size of the screen or the room you're in or whatever. But at least that helps the student visualize where the pancreas is in this. Even though this is simplified, it's still kind of a complex image. Okay, so again, I need to store this view to make sure that label stays. And then I'm going to add another slide, and I'm going to change this up a little bit. So the next thing I want to do is I want to show the pancreas alone with no other organs around it, so that the students can see the vertebral relationship with the pancreas and they know what vertebrae are nearby. So the easiest way to do that will probably be to grab all of the digestive organs and move them all out of the way, and then grab the pancreas and put it back. I think that'll be the easiest way to do it. So I'll grab my digestive organs because I had that group going. Oops. Forgot this is grouped kind of in two different ways. The digestive organs are one group and the stomach is another group, so I need to do this in kind of two pieces. So I'll grab these and move them out of the way. Oh, you know what? That's funny. I didn't have my mouse on the pan function. I have to remember to do that. If I'm trying to move objects, I have to have this highlighted, not the note. Okay, so let's try this then. So we're moving those out of the way. We're moving these out of the way. This is coming. The colon is presented in sections so that you can demonstrate the layers of the colon. So that's what we're looking at there. I've got layers on this duodenum as well, so I might have to move those off in segments, but it just takes a minute. Here they come, here they come. Okay, got all those layers off. And then I can do the same thing with colon as well. 2, 3, 4, and then the corners all just kind of move by themselves. So there, you'll have to sort of play with it to see how these different parts kind of move around. It's totally okay if you have your organs kind of all over the place around the model. It really won't affect the look of it once you're kind of zoomed in where you want to be. You won't even see them. So you can kind of think about this as your presentation space, and everything all around it is like your sandbox, where you have all your parts kind of stored. There's layers on this segment of jejunum as well, I think. 6. Pull this over. I really just want to make sure there's nothing there other than that pancreas. And maybe I would be interested in showing how the bile duct and the pancreas relate, but that's not where we're at right now. I want to remove these things and keep them out of the field so that I can really have a targeted presentation. And this is sort of what you need to think about when you're putting your session together, is like, what exactly do I want the students to see? Because if you present too many other things in the field, it's just visual distraction, and it makes it even less useful. Grab that bit over. Okay. Than if you didn't even present it at all. So just always kind of have in mind, what's the bare minimum I need to show them. So this looks pretty good. This is really just pancreas, and there's like a little accessory pancreatic duct there, but we can leave that. I can reposition my label so that it's in the field again. And if I'm satisfied with this, I'll go ahead and store it. Perfect. So maybe while I'm lecturing, I might want to emphasize that the pancreas is typically found at the level of the first lumbar vertebra. If I wanted to reveal that in lecture by rotating it and then mousing over to show it, I could just do it that way. If I wanted to have it more static, you could add a call out to the vertebra, and then there it is. You can depict the relationship that way. If I'm having students work on it on their own, I'll probably not label it, and I'll instead, in the session, I'll create a note to the student that says something like, the pancreas is found at a particular vertebral level. Rotate the model and mouse over to find it, or something like that, and then the student can do that on their own and identify the vertebra by discovering it rather than me telling them. So I like the way it looks. I'm going to store it. Let's make one more slide where we show the pancreas relationship to the aorta, just so we can sort of see what it's like to bring something back into the mix. So my aorta is obviously over here. If I click on it, I can tell I've selected it because its name shows up down here. So I'm going to move it and then put it back in its anatomical position. I'll add the IVC too. Put that in there. And then maybe just for kicks, we'll do the superior mesenteric and the celiac trunk, since they have, close proximity relationships to pancreas. The celiac trunk probably would be most effective if I added its major branches as well: splenic artery, left gastric, the common hepatic. If I just move them all together, so I just did the control thing there, where I clicked one, and then I control, and then I keep clicking to put more in the group. And then once I've got them selected, I can grab them and move them over. And again, I'll need to select them all again. And once they're selected, I can move them. And if I just get my mouse on top of the shadow, then it'll turn that greenish yellow color, and that means I can just drop it and it'll snap in place. So if you just get it close enough, it'll get it right on the spot where it's supposed to be. Okay, so this does a nice job of showing these vascular relationships around the pancreas. I like the way that looks. I need to get rid of these labels. That isn't helpful anymore. And one thing I figured out is if I just typed over that box and typed a new label in there, that actually is not as stable as if you just did a new one. So if I had a new set of directions for this slide, it's better to delete the first note and just make a new one. It makes it more stable in the simulation. So maybe here I'd say like mouse over the arteries to find out which arteries are close to the pancreas as a instruction. This would be if I was having the students do it on their own. If I was doing it in class, I wouldn't have this there, obviously. I would just have the slide as it is, and then I'd verbally explain the relationships and maybe just mouse over the structures as I'm describing it. And that way, as I'm in the session, since I've built this in as a series of slides, here I'm going to save this quick. Since I've built this as a series of slides, I don't have to do a whole lot of fooling around in class. I can just start my session and I can say, hey guys, we're going to talk about the pancreas. And you can tell it's here in the C loop of the duodenum. And I go my next slide and I talk about the relationship to the vertebra. And all I really have to do is move my mouse, point, talk, maybe rotate it a little bit, which isn't so bad. Maybe zoom in and out, that's not so bad. But I'm not doing the pulling of the objects in front of the class because that just, nobody has the patience to watch that. Certainly not our young students. And so having all of these things sort of built in makes it really easy to just build a stepwise presentation. So that's why at the beginning I mentioned, being really clear about what you want to demonstrate really helps with setting up these presentations one by one. Okay, so I think the last thing that I wanted to say, well, I guess one more thing before I get to the pedagogy part. So picking your key views is really helpful. Doing everything from a straight-on view makes sense at first because that's sort of maybe how you're thinking about it. But mixing in a few oblique views like this really does help quite a bit with the 3D relationship building. So maybe I'd add a slide that just looks something like this into the mix so that when I go from here, I can immediately go to the next slide and emphasize the relationships that may not be obvious at first to somebody who doesn't have a innately strong three-dimensional spatial sense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the pedagogy of how to use this in the classroom. I have identified over several years 2 really good ways to use this in class, and it's at the beginning of a lesson and at the end. That seems to be the most effective. So at the beginning, I like to use it if I'm introducing students to a brand new region that they've never seen before. Something like the pelvic floor area. I mean, that's an area that most students really haven't seen much of, and they probably don't really understand the three-dimensional shape. So it's kind of nice to be able to show them that before we even start talking about the names of the muscles. So providing a prominent visual context at the beginning of the lesson can be really effective for that. Another way that I think it's really effective is at the end, after you've worked through, a variety of terms and you've presented things in sort of flat two-dimensional images and presented it in that sort of simplified way, circling back to the three-dimensional model with everything together can be a nice way to pull all the different elements together into one presentation. So I would recommend trying both ways, see what works best for you and your students. Like making lots of small bite-sized video or session chunks is a good idea. If you're working your way through the GI tract, you might make one for every group of organs, or maybe make one for the liver and one for the intestines or something. But that's my sort of gut reaction of some really important things that I think would help as you get started. Please feel free to contact me if you want to talk more about how you're using it or how I'm using it. It's a fun thing to work with as an instructor. It feels like something that adds to my creative toolbox, and I hope you feel the same way. I think that's all I got for this session. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks a lot.